Welcome, everyone. I'm Mark Roselle. I serve as the Dean of the Schar School of Policy and Government here at George Mason University. For those of you who don't know, we're one of 10 schools or colleges of the university. And we do public policy, political science, public administration, international security, a large number of academic programs, bachelor's, master's, and PhD. And we also host a number of high-impact research centers and centers that are very good at reaching out publicly on issues of the day. And certainly the great title of this program, Can Iranian Women Change the World, is very, very topical, and I'm very appreciative of the opportunity to have this program at the Schar School tonight. Since 2020, the Gender Policy Center has hosted more than a dozen events that highlight critical issues with a focus on the role of women in politics, policy, and public life. GAP, as we call it, gender policy, has tackled topics including criminal justice reform, data feminism, the student loan crisis, the COVID impact in both the workplace and in the domestic sphere. GAP events bring together an alternating mix of academic researchers, analysts, activists, journalists, policymakers, and practitioners. And the center's research projects and publications have included teams of undergraduate researchers that we're very proud of, high school interns, graduate students, and faculty colleagues across different academic units of the university. This evening, for GAP's first in-person event since 2020, for which we're very grateful. We're still working at getting people to come back in person for our public events, and it's starting to pick up. We are delighted to continue our tradition of investigation and dialogue around women's roles in shaping, maintaining, and preserving democratic institutions and society. Recent events in Iran, where women have been at the forefront of the struggle to advance their own autonomy and preserve human rights, provide the inspiration for this panel discussion and the accompanying really impressive art exhibit in the gallery just outside the auditorium. I hope you've had a chance to take a look at it or will this evening. So my gratitude to our panelists, our partners for their participation this evening, and of course to my colleague, Associate Dean of the Schar School, Dr. Bonnie Stabile, who is the founder and director of the Gender and Policy Center, for continuing to focus on issues of women's representation and equity. And with that, I turn the program over to my colleague, Bonnie Stabile, and the panel. Bonnie.
Thanks, Mark. Thank you all so much for being here. As Mark started to say, the Gender and Policy Center was established in 2017, and our primary purpose is to investigate the underrepresentation of women in positions of power and influence in the public sphere, and to also look at the issues where there are policy inequities for women and other underrepresented groups. So certainly a movement that has the prominent monikers of women, life, and liberty, or certainly something that we thought we had to give some voice to while we were here this evening. I would say that I want to give thanks right from the beginning to Miriam Ovisi, one of my friends and mentors and board members and supporters. She really was the impetus behind bringing this event together and bringing the wonderful art gallery display here, and bringing her crew of amazing people with her for this event. So thank you so much. So, and just so you know, what we plan to do is just have a conversation. In every policy class I have, as the topics are not always fun or light. So what we try to do is start with a definition of the problem. This is like policy analysis 101, right? Problem definition, but then get to some policy alternatives or potential resolutions or solutions, right? So we want to investigate what's happening and what are some of the cultural and political antecedents of where we find ourselves, but then move to, because we could just be in despair all night, but then we want to move to, well, what can we do? And then the little bit of despair there is that what we can do sometimes is more limited than we would like. But we always want to end on that note of action, and how we can, as all of the forces we can bring to bear, to be in dialogue with each other about these problems and what we can do about them. Because everything that's happening in Iran right now, or the plight of women around the world, just like every other policy issue, it's both an individual and a collective problem or situation. And individually, so we are concerned, of course, about the infringements of personal liberty and the burdens they impose on individuals in the course of their lives. But then what drew me to policy was probably the false notion that I could look at things at a collective level, right? Like, let's try to look for solutions. When there are systemic problems, can we find solutions to those? And identifying that systematic element is what public policy is supposed to do. So just like the medical profession, if you go to the doctor for your individual health problem, you're looking for an answer. But if public health is a population level endeavor, and both of those things are needed. So I think our conversation tonight will try to explore the policy context, and then also look for some solutions. And we're looking for those, both the source of problems and their solutions are to be found in both the cultural and political milieu. So that's where we'll be exploring tonight. I want to introduce my panelists. Cameron, you're going to have to pronounce, I'm not going to pronounce your last name, you're going to have to do it for me, but Cameron is the policy director of MUFTI, the National Union for Democracy in Iran. And that organization pursues US policy towards Iran based on human rights and democracy. So he will be sort of setting up the policy landscape for us. And Suzanne Abadian is joining us. She's a Fulbright Fellow. She's an author of Generative Cultural Renewal, a recent book that she's written about effective resources for ending female genital mutilation. She has a PhD in political economy and government from Harvard University. And very impressive to me is that your dissertation chair was Amartya Sen, Nobel Prize winning political economist. And we share some time we just discovered at the Kennedy School. I was an administrator there years ago in executive ed, and Suzanne has a master's degree in international development from the Kennedy School. And Suzanne's work is really about, both on the prescriptive side, understanding what causes these problems, but also on generating solutions. And so her focus in much of her work has been on collective trauma, cultural renewal, and just thinking about how women are controlled and silenced, and that form of oppression creates trauma at the individual and population level. So again, thanks to Miriam for bringing us together, because we're already cooking up a lot of ideas of things that we can be doing events and talking to people about troubling things for a long time to come. So we're looking forward to that. We lost a panelist, Marjan Greenblatt from the Middle East Institute, who would have spoken about from a human rights activist perspective, was expected on the panel, but she had a sick child and a husband out of town, so she couldn't join us. So we're sorry that she's not here, but we agreed, and I'm sure my husband is here to attest, that we can talk for a long time about any problem whatsoever. Before, as we're launching in, I just want to say my perspective is I just wrote a book called Women, Power, and Rape Culture. As I said, think about our books. Wow, we're a good time at a party. But anyway, but it's about the politics and policy of underrepresentation. So all these things are about what causes women to be underrepresented and ultimately silenced in the public sphere. And really, I'm thinking we could do better with some of the outcomes in the world. And I think that more balance and representation of these energies and intellects would probably yield better outcomes. And even if we're not sure about that, let's give it a try, because, things haven't gone so well. Yeah. So that's kind of where we're coming from. So I guess I'm going to start with Cameron. You might each, before you speak, if you want to say anything about your organization or your work, to kind of acquaint us with that, and then go into, so for Cameron, the policy context, sort of where are we now? Of course, we're here because of this very dramatic focusing event of the murder of this young woman. And women have long been, policed, how women dress and where women can go and what they say is historically, both politically and culturally, something that is, has been a real issue. So I'll stop and go and let you talk about policy context.
Well, thank you very much, Dean, for the welcome, and thank you for hosting us, and thank you, Dr. Stabile, for your most kind hospitality. It's a pleasure to be here at the Shar School, and a particular pleasure to be at the Gender and Policy program. When we talk about women being underrepresented and women being denied their rightful place in society and politics, there's no more apt place about which to discuss that than Iran in the world today. As you're probably all well aware, for the past 5 months, Iranian women have been at the forefront of what many are calling the first women-led revolution in the world. The slogan of this revolution is quite clear and quite descriptive, actually, in its slogan of women, life, freedom. But to start, as you said, from the policy perspective, how did we get here? What's brought us here? It's important to recognize a fundamental difference in the repression and suppression that women face in Iran from the suppression and the repression and the limitations that women face really anywhere else in the world, largely. In the United States, we're obviously, and the rest of the Western world, still struggling with our own attempts to bring about greater measures and greater gender equality, be it in the workplace, be it in society, be it in politics. And those limitations or those discrepancies are, as you said, largely the result of a cultural or a social milieu and a variety of limitations, which there are many better suited people to discuss that than I, but it's something we all know exists in the United States and in the West. But what has been happening in Iran for the past 4 years, as we're basically on the anniversary of the Islamic Revolution in Iran, is not just social and cultural. It is indeed mainly political. But because what's often said about the limitations placed on Iranian women or the discrepancies between public participation of Iranian women and Iranian men is, well, this is a cultural issue. This is their culture. As it was said on the West Wing very well, we're not talking about wearing clogs. We're talking about 44 years of a government that has systematically oppressed, segregated, abused, terrorized, and killed Iranian women. This is not part of our culture. This is not part of Iranian culture. This is something that has been forced upon the people of Iran by a political apparatus in the name of the Islamic Republic, which many, I think, would argue is not Islamic and is not really a republic. And there's some debate about that, but that's what's been happening for the past 44 years in Iran. Iranian women before this regime came into power received the right to vote before women in Switzerland did. Iranian women before this regime came into power were ministers. They were leaders in the judicial branch. They were leaders in the private sector. As soon as this regime came into power, its first and foremost target was Iranian women. That Iranian female minister that I talked about was executed as soon as this regime came into power. That Iranian female judge that I talked about was disbarred as soon as this regime came into power. So this is not merely the result of social and cultural limitations placed on women in Iran. It is first and foremost the result of a political decision, an ideological decision to limit, to persecute, to suppress, to repress Iranian women. Because indeed in our history, Iranian women have changed the world. They've changed the direction of the country. We've had miraculously powerful and constructive queens in Iran's history. Some of the greatest heroes in our national epic, the Shahnameh, the Book of Kings, are people like Gordal Farid, famous female warriors. That's our culture. That's who we are as Iranians. And that's actually a lot of what Iranians are trying to, as they say in their slogans, reclaim right now. In addition to women, life, freedom, and it's one of the subtitles of our conversation today, Iranians are trying to reclaim their country. They view this regime as an invading, occupying force, not just as a government that they really don't care for, but as something that is almost alien to their values, to their heritage, to their history, and they're looking to reclaim their country from it. And we can get a bit more into the policy, but I just wanted to set our conversation with that the problem that Iranian women face is very different from other problems of gender inequity that we see elsewhere in the world, and it's almost incomparable in my assessment.
Thank you for those comments. And what you were saying about, it's not wearing clogs, I was thinking about Martha Nussbaum talking about, who wrote a book called Sex and Social Justice. And in that book, she says, she kind of rails against cultural relativism, because there's always this idea we shouldn't interfere. It's kind of an excuse not to interfere. But she talked about intellectuals and academics really just observing things like female genital mutilation in other populations and being kind of hands off. And what she asserts in the book is we can't do that. The intervention that's a whole other problem, right? How do you do, easier said than done. How do we intervene when these types of things happen? But merely deciding that we ought to is a stance that we take, right? So can we say like it's just happening there, and it's also a matter of degrees. Like if people are denied of basic human rights or even the very right to live or express themselves, then it's incumbent on the rest of the world to do something. And then I'm not here to say I don't have the answers. But what do we do? That's the difficult question. So Suzanne, with your will you tell us from your perspective what's happening now and kind of where we are in the present moment?
Yeah, thank you, and thanks, Kaman. That was a wonderful introduction to this whole thing. And thank you guys for being here. It's so wonderful to see everyone in person. So those of you, this is apparently the first time, but it's also my first time also engaging with an audience in person in this way. So it's really lovely to be here. The book that I just published in October of this past year is about this topic as well, about the issue of cultural relativism. It takes apart the whole argument. The first part of the book is about the very important notion that we have to respect other people's cultures. Of course, that notion is a very valuable culture notion. I come from an anthropology background, so I have a master's degree in anthropology as well as a master's degree in international development. So I come from a background that really appreciates the importance of respecting and honoring everyone's culture. But the thing about cultures is that a lot of it's in place that may need updating. And how do we decide that? And so the first part of my book takes apart the argument of when it's not useful to think in terms of relativism. The second part of the book is about interventions that are both ethical and effective. And so that's in that book, I talk about female genital mutilation as a very extreme example. But even in that example, a lot of human rights people say that we should not intervene because women are doing it to women. Women consent to this. So who are we to then say no to that if women are doing this to women? So the whole issue, I take apart the argument of consent because I developed a notion called adaptive consent, that women in consenting are adapting oftentimes to limiting situations, trauma, anyway, it's developed fully. So even if we're consenting, whatever that word consent means, I take it, takes the term apart, we need to look at that notion of what consent really is. When is consent not consent, basically? But anyway, in the case of Iran, I think the way that I would add to the rich conversation that's already begun, that Kaman started, is the way I look at it. I guess the perspective I have is of thousands of years. So I'm not looking at what's happening in Iran just past 4 decades or even 100 years, but as someone who's looked at collective trauma. So I used to work internationally, but started to focus more in the US and Canada on Native American, tribal, and indigenous communities, and looked at poverty alleviation in these communities. And I soon, therefore, I became an expert in collective trauma, not willingly in a way, because as Bonnie said, we don't make great conversationalists at parties, although we're really fun people. But collective trauma. But I became very interested in the topic of collective trauma because when I worked in Native communities and learned from communities, the thing they would tell me over and over again is how much their history has continued to affect them in the current time period. So, and that's the traumas that were there ancestrally are continuing now. And so I became very interested in, well, how does that happen? How do traumas linger in communities over hundreds of years? So what I see in Iran right now, I do think part of the challenge is that we had a culture, and what we're seeing, we had a culture that was pre-Islamic. And this isn't about Islam, but it's about what was there before, was a culture that honored women, life, and freedom. So for me, the slogan is really about Iran reclaiming itself. And the battle in Iran right now, from my perspective, is over a millennia old. It's a battle of a people trying to rebalance its value of women. Before, our traditional ancient Iranian culture always held women in high esteem. It always valued life. Life meaning in the spirituality of the Iranian people, the ancient spirituality, the life on earth was valued. We weren't waiting to go to heaven. This was not a purgatory to be, so life on earth was valued. Color, celebration, Nowruz, the Iranian, holdover from our ancient traditions, is a time of massive, joyous celebration. And many of the those ancient cultural values and traditions were all about celebration. Celebration of life, celebration of love. We're a nation of lovers. We are about love. We're about enjoyment of the earth. So it's about women, life, and believe it or not, freedom. The spiritual tradition that dates thousands of years old, the preeminent value was freedom of choice. There was a value of freedom. Children were not told to pick. Zoroastrianism was the religion of that ancient land. I'm Zoroastrian by birth, so I know something about this tradition. And we're only 20,000 left in Iran. We've been pretty much wiped out. So there are very few of us who could speak to that ancient culture. But that tradition valued the choice to make, to even choose your faith. Nobody can force your religion on you. There's no forcing of religion on people. And there's no notion of blasphemy because there's a lot of notion of, evolving our understanding of our relationship to whatever the divine is. So freedom is inherently an ancient Iranian value, freedom of choice. And so the slogan is it's about, and all societies try to do this. I mean, all societies have been traumatized, try to reclaim and renew themselves in some capacity. And what I'm seeing right now in Iran is an attempt to do that. We see it, and many of our societies don't do it very healthfully. So traumatized communities, we saw it in Nazi Germany when Hitler tried to renew culture. That's what he thought he was doing. We see it in Serbia. The Serbs tried to renew culture when Yugoslavia fragmented. We see it in, even ISIS, but these are traumatized communities who did a very unskillful job of trying to renew culture. And they recreated trauma over and over again. So in my book, I talk about generative cultural renewal. How do you actually renew culture in ways that are generative, that do not create more trauma in their wake? What does it mean? How do you do that? So, that's really what I think, that's now the hope for Iran is that as we renew ourselves, we do it in a way that reduces the trauma footprint. And part of that is bringing women into primary roles because women has been demonstrated. These are now studies. First of all, nonviolent resistance is the most successful forms of resistance to any kind of regime change. But also women will bring nonviolence, are more likely to be nonviolent. So anyway, I don't want to keep going, but just as a beginning conversation, but women have to be brought in. They change the world because the change they bring will stick because it's nonviolent. It tends to be nonviolent. And and more lasting as a result. And cross-cutting, I mean, there's a lot more we can say, and I want to talk more about that, but those are some beginning comments.
Yes, thank you so much. I think it's interesting that you brought up choice, because the strictures that are put in place are really often about who chooses, right? It's about power, right? Who gets to decide for whom and who gets to give voice. And if you look at societies globally, right, that the vanguard of repression is how we treat people who've been historically underrepresented groups, right?
Yeah.
Historically subjugated peoples. And that unfortunately includes women in pretty much every place in the world, to lesser and greater degrees. So, I mean, if you think about, and there are all different kinds of expressions of protest, but think about the Women's March in 2017 here, right? So this started this, sort of hopeful moment, but women felt like they had been silenced, culturally and politically for a long time. So that was a rising up. But I think this idea about laws and policies and cultural traditions that limit choice for some are something that I hope we can investigate. And I just wanted to bring up, particularly where women are concerned. So the philosopher Kate Mann, who wrote a great book recently called Down Girl, she talks about the difference between sexism and misogyny. And I mean, sexism is really just this disparagement of women that sort of says women aren't as capable and therefore they don't deserve to be in public life. And that's sort of an underpinning of belief, both unconscious and consciously, that has, led to the explicit and implicit silencing and othering of women in the public sphere. But what she says about sexism is it's about this system of beliefs. What she says misogyny is the law enforcement arm of sexism. It's the rules and policies and mechanisms that perpetuate those things. How do we break out of those? And so I think that is just one of those beautiful, nice articulations of what's the difference of these words. But again, the mechanisms, and they can be political or otherwise, but that is this idea of how do we deal with it. So I'm gonna go back to Cameron now to start talking about some things about mechanisms. These are the mechanisms that sort of lead to women's oppression. And they can be as extreme as torture or, the arrest of journalists. I think I read something like 17 women journalists have been arrested, 500 protesters have been killed, all the numbers of people, thousands of people being detained, right? So it can be very strongly overt like that or much more subtle. But still forms of oppression nonetheless. So
I think that the distinction that you alluded to is a very apt one when it comes to Iran, because going back to my previous comments about really just how much of a different level what's going on in Iran is, not at all to discount any disparities or any sexism or misogyny that exists elsewhere, but since the topic of course tonight is Iran, it really is misogyny. In fact, a term that we hear used very often to refer to Iran by women from inside the country is that of a gender apartheid. They refer to the Islamic Republic as a gender apartheid state. We have separate taxis, separate subway cars, separate parts of parks, for example, for women and men in Iran. Of course, this is often almost laughably described as a way to protect women, but we all know that really it's a way to limit women, to limit their presence in the public space. So this existence of a gender apartheid in Iran for the past 44 years has a variety of legal manifestations. The first of which is that constitutionally in Iran, legally, statutorily in Iran, women are worth half of men. This is in the law. This is not my personal, exaggeration. In a court of law in Iran, it takes 2 female witnesses to equal the testimony of 1 male witness, because they're worth half of men. When a father passes away, the son receives statutorily twice the amount of inheritance that his sister receives, because he's worth twice that of his sister. So these are the policy, the legal, the statutory limitations placed on Iranian women for the past 40 years. And it really is meant to be a mechanism of control, because what this regime has tried to do from its very first days is control everything. control Iranian national identity, the Millat Iran, the Iranian nation, by attempting to supplant that with Ummat Islam, the Islamic nation or the Islamic Brotherhood. And for example, Susan will know much better about this than me, but there were attempts very early on in this regime's tenure to, for example, ban the public celebration of Nowruz, our national holiday, the Iranian New Year, where we celebrate rebirth and hope, as you said, and try to replace it with Islamic holidays. Whereas before the revolution, there's a saying which is quite common in Iran, that before the revolution, people would pray at home and dance and drink outside. And now people pray outside and they dance and drink inside. Because there's this forced hypocrisy on Iranians. Iranians have been forced for 44 years to lie, to pretend, to put on a different face when they walk outside. In Iranian schools for many years, they would ask their parents, especially as technology, they would ask, teachers would ask their students, do your parents have VCRs at home? What kind of films are they watching? Because VCRs and many of these films were banned. And then as technology progressed, do your parents have satellites at home? Because satellites were first illegal when they came out. It's been an attempt to control every part of Iranian people's lives from day one. And that's what distinguishes a dictatorship from a totalitarian state. And in Iran, we have a totalitarian state, attempting first and foremost to control women, to control their bodies, to control the clothes that they wear, they're forced to wear. One of the first slogans that the revolutionaries, after the success of the revolution in 1979 gave was Yaru Sari, Ya Tu Sari. Either you take the headscarf or you take one in the head. And these revolutionary thugs marched through the streets of Tehran and other cities, beating women, enforced the hijab onto the heads of Iranian women. Whereas before the revolution, we had on the same street, in the same shop, in the same taxi, in the same subway car, a woman wearing no head covering, a woman wearing a light hijab, and a woman wearing a full black, all-encompassing chador. This regime has attempted to take every iota of personal autonomy away from Iranians, and particularly away from Iranian women. And that is extended to every other aspect and sector and strata of society, unfortunately. So these are some of the policy and statutory limitations that are placed on women. And that's why what you see now in Iran, and just to clarify another point in case anyone was wondering, what do Iranian women want now? What do the Iranian people want now? Because even after 5 months of Iranians on the streets, I still sometimes find this not being properly addressed in the media or in the popular consciousness. They're not asking for reforms. They don't want slight changes. They don't just want to be able to choose whether or not to wear the hijab. They want to get rid of the Islamic Republic. What's happening in Iran is not a movement for reform. It's not a movement for some slight change. It's not a movement just for equality for women. It is a revolution. The slogans that they're chanting could not be more clear. And related to your point, Dr. Stabile, of cultural relativism, I often find this arrogance, if I can use that term, when it comes to Iran analysis, which is diluting the aspirations and the demands of Iranians. When Iranians are on the streets chanting, death to the dictator, freedom, 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 and all these other revolutionary chants, and the popular media or the popular consciousness, wow, what a remarkable reform movement we're seeing in Iran. They're not asking for reform. If they were asking for reform, they have mouths and they have a vocabulary, and they would use their mouths to say the word reform. But they're not asking for that. They want a fundamental political change in Iran. And what's been most inspiring to me in that aspiration for this fundamental political change has been the unity that Iranians have shown. Iranian men and women. We talk, of course, about the now famous slogan, Women, Life, Freedom. There's a video that I'll never forget of students sitting in the courtyard of their school. I think it was in Tabriz in northern Iran, but I could be mistaken about the city. And the male students are chanting Zan Zendegi Azadi, women, life, freedom, the male students. And the female students respond with another popular slogan, Mard Mihan Abadi, man, homeland, Mard Mihan Abadi, man, prosperity, man, homeland, prosperity. So the male students are chanting for their female colleagues and for their female fellow students and for their freedom and for their life. And the female students are chanting for their male colleagues and for their prosperity and for their freedom. So the unity that Iranians are showing across gender lines, across socioeconomic lines, across linguistic lines, across geographic lines in our many provinces is unprecedented. And that's what this regime fears the most. And that's why this regime has, for the past 40 years, made it, in my assessment, its number one goal to sow discord amongst Iranians inside the country, amongst Iranians abroad, between Iranians at home and abroad. And now the unity that Iranians are showing inside the country and across the globe is such a threat to them. And that's why their attempts to divide Iranians are increasing. I'm sure the Iranians who are here today and those who are watching live or later know about the regime's famous cyber army. They know about all their attempts to do this. So what the regime is now facing is a revolutionary movement by a nation united against it. It started with the murder of Mahsa Jina and has now become a national revolution. First to free Iranian women, but then to free the entire country.
So you mentioned, how this is represented in the press and the international community, and today I was reading about a campaign by human rights organizations internationally with a very powerful symbol. So afterwards, when we have the reception, we'll be looking at some very powerful symbols in the gallery. But this one was for a campaign called Cut the Oppression, and it was a symbol of a woman's braided hair fashioned as a noose being cut off by scissors. And it was an appeal to the international community to take action and to call upon the regime, right, for change, and for the international community to act. But I guess I'll ask, and I guess Suzanne, you can talk about this next, but what can the international community do? So expressions of support are important, but, I guess two questions and for both of you. What can the international community do, and how can it be sustainable and valid given all the geopolitics involved? Any part of that. We could be here all night.
Yeah, and I want to make sure we have time for questions, so
Yes.
it is,
We do.
what do
So-
we do? Okay.
Yeah. Yes.
I just wanted to say that, I agree with everything Kamran is saying. And
Usually nobody says that to me, so I appreciate that.
I do agree
Take that one.
and respect your opinion. And I want to just also understand that Iran of the past 44 years, and I'm not a supporter of this regime, is filled with a lot of idealism. The system, I guess my hope is that we break down silos between those who are Islamic and those who are not. And I think for Iran to progress, we're going to have to bring everyone, as many people as we can, with us. So somehow we have to break down the silo of, the people who are in the regime, because I bet there are a lot of, I know people will disagree with me, but I know from my experience, having met some of the people in that regime in the past, and other people who've been from other countries who've been made to be really bad guys, who turned out there are people within that system that were not so bad. We have to find people in that regime that we can bring along, right? We have to partner with them somehow. This system's not going to change unless we bring as many people along. And the Iran of the future, and it's going to happen. I don't know when it's going to happen, but this is inevitable. I cannot imagine that Iran isn't going to transform at some point. And under that new system, it's going to be a pluralistic system where everyone is allowed to be as they are and given permission to wear, not wear, do this, do that. So, we have to find a way to bring, and I know you agree with me on this, that we just have to bring our deeply religious Muslim brothers and sisters along with us somehow. And so I think that's where women are really powerful, because we do break through these silos much more easily. And we connect on many levels. We connect at the level of relationships and children. I mean, I don't want to be traditional, but we do. And things that matter. I mean, one of the panelists isn't more. Why isn't she here? Because she had a sick child to take care of, and her husband was traveling. Well, guess what? Why aren't more women in the streets? Because they're busy managing everything. They're taking care of their elders, they're taking care of the kids, they're making sure dinner's on the table. They're taking care of life. So the way we can help is we talk about money. We need to generate funds so that people can strike and take off work. But also we have the funds to support women. We have to have ways to support women in these countries, all the basic ways. So the elders are taken care of, the children are, so they can get out in the streets, they can actually, participate. So money has to be generated. I think that's one of the things that we've got to, I mean, people can't take time to strike, go on strikes easily. And I mean, how much, so there's a reason why young women are in the streets, not so much the older women, because the older women are busy cooking dinner, or whatever, handling all the other things that need to be handled. So anyway, I think that with a gender lens, we got to really realistically see what life looks like for a lot of women in these societies. And I'm also really concerned about the day after, because I do think this is inevitable, that this thing's going to turn. But what is life going to look like? How do we create democracy after this regime, and how do we bring as many people from this regime with us? And what are the off-ramps for them? Like, how can there are a lot of idealistic people who had the Islamic Revolution. I didn't agree with them, but there was idealism. So how do we bring them along? How do we, and again, we're talking about democracy, but Iranians are spiritual people. We know very few people talk about spirituality and meaning making, and how do we create, there's a lot of people heartbroken and disillusioned, and and how do we bring them along? How do we rekindle hope and a spirituality that allows for pluralism and decision making? And it's also about reframing masculinity. I mean, I loved what you said, because a lot of unfortunately, women can't do this right alone. The men have to help us. And part of it is the whole notion of what it means to be a man has to be changed. Right now, what it means to be a man in many of these countries, it's to, it's about domination and power, and it's not power with, it's power over women and power over children. I mean, the whole way of raising children, the father being a certain way, I mean, that whole way of being has to be changed. So it's at the level of changing culture, child rearing practices. I mean, it's really basic stuff, right? Education, child rearing, how masculinity is presented, what it means to be a man, what it means to be a woman. I mean, all those things have to be changed. And so we can do that. We can, that's already begun, obviously, that conversation's begun. Iran's a very sophisticated culture, and young people are having those conversations. And anyway, so I think we can help by continuing those conversations here and drawing attention to it, and also hope, because I think, this country has been under pressure for 44 years. Iranians who've been out of the country, we have our own traumas. I've been here since I was 5 years old, but there's not a day that goes by that I don't think of Iran. I mean, my dream was always to go back to Iran and work there. And that dream, I was telling Carmen, I was listening to Persian music in the car driving here and trying really hard to not cry and kind of contain myself. But Iranians are very passionate about Iran. And anyway, we got to, we from the outside can rekindle hope for them, because, and hold the vision of this is going to happen, it's inevitable, and we're here with you, you're not alone in this. I think that's, I think trauma, the reason why trauma continues is people feel alone in their traumas. And to let people know that they're not alone, and we're going to be here for them. I mean, I think what you're saying of this regime, and lots of people who've been traumatized, they lose trust. They lose trust in people being there for them. They lose trust in God, whatever God they believe there is. And they lose trust in themselves that they can make a change. So the fact that Iran's actually mobilizing to make a change shows that it's kind of breaking through the trauma. And now we have to reconnect and show that we can be there for them in a way, and that the international community can be there for them. Because that's another big wound for Iranians and many people in the third world or developing countries, is they feel betrayed by the US or Europe, England is another big, the colonizing forces. And the idea that we can actually somehow be there for them in some capacity is very meaningful, I think, for them. It's going to change the narrative. A lot of my work is about how do you transform trauma narratives. And one of the big trauma narratives is we're alone in this. And these people will come and get us in the end, and there's a whole narrative in Iran about the US and England in particular, and the whole conspiracy theories. And so
Usually they're true, but that's
there's always elements of truth. It's like, what do you want to emphasize? Right? I mean, there's always elements of truth, but which direction do we want to take it? What's more productive? And how do we build trusting, long-standing relationships going forward?
Before I talk about the policy, if I could just talk about, just feel something that Dr. Abadian said, which is the cultural aspect of what's going on and what has to happen in Iran. And I couldn't agree more with your comments about the need, what I think it's perhaps appropriately termed as national reconciliation. What Iranians need after the fall of this regime is national reconciliation. Because, as I said, this regime has tried to supplant inorganically the Ummat, the Islamic Brotherhood or the nation with the Iranian, for the Iranian nation, the Millat, is Iranians have to, in their capacity as citizens, as Iranian citizens, we don't have a long history as great as many things were prior to this regime, economically, socially, culturally, and we can talk a lot about that. Iranians don't have a long history of being active citizens. We don't have a democratic experience, really, as democratic citizens, as stakeholders in the society. And so Iranians, beyond the political change, beyond what we all hope is a secular democracy, whatever its final form may be in Iran, we have to have this cultural revitalization and this what's better termed in Persian as farhang sazi, creating a new culture almost, or redeveloping, reclaiming our culture that we had before. And that involves all Iranians, Iranian Muslims, Iranian Jews, Iranian Baha'is, Iranian atheists, Iranian Zoroastrians, Iranians who aren't really sure what's going on when it comes to those kind of things, Iranian women, men, LGBTQ, everyone. We need a national reconciliation because after 44 years of this regime, Iranians, I think, have come to realize they have to rely on one another, really only. That's all that they have to rely on is one another, irrespective of their backgrounds. And that's what you see right now on the streets of Iran. People who are on the front lines of protesters aren't looking over as they're throwing rocks at the regime police guard and saying, by the way, are you Baha'i or are you Jewish? They don't care. First of all, if they're Baha'i or Jewish, they're probably in prison. But they're not asking each other about their differences or whether they're going to vote for a monarchy or a republic or whether they're a mujahideen or whatever. They're fighting for a free Iran, and they're almost practicing that national reconciliation on the streets right now. And it's something I think Iranians abroad are taking their cue from. If Iranians abroad are united, it's because they're learning from Iranians inside the country. And they're practicing this national reconciliation now, and that includes after those in the armed forces say who take the step finally to step away from this regime and to join the Iranian people. Those people have to be found in a new place in the new Iran. And as I speak briefly about the policy implications of this and how we can help in some way, it's important to set the stage with what we're not talking about. Because another common misconception that so many of us Iranians have faced, who have talked about, or Iranian Americans have faced, who have talked about this issue of human rights and democracy in Iran. It was years that if you said the words Iran and human rights or Iran and democracy in a sentence, you were called a warmonger, you were called a regime changer, you were called Ahmad Chalabi, you were called a Dick Cheney sidekick. Innumerable things that you could be called. Why? Because you want equality for men and women in Iran. Why? Because you want rights for Iranian workers. Why? Because you want to help protect the Iranian environment. So really those who have defended and promoted human rights and democracy in Iran for 4 decades now have been really libeled and slandered with these really nasty terms. So what we're not talking about is foreign-led regime change in Iran. What we're talking about is supporting the Iranian people and honoring their rights and their ability to determine their own destiny. Because Iranians are on the streets fighting for their future, fighting to reclaim their country, fighting for their sisters, fighting for their brothers to the left and to the right of them. They don't expect, nor do they want, the world to do this for them. What they would appreciate, I think, however, is if the world could, A, not help their oppressors. And for so long, we've heard this rhetoric of not interfering in Iran's internal affairs, Iran's domestic affairs. What Iranians are now saying is, if you want to go back to the JCPOA, you are interfering in our domestic affairs, and you're doing so on behalf of the Islamic Republic. And so the first step from a policy perspective is not to enable the Islamic Republic, not to send in billions of dollars to buy bullets to fire into the hearts and the eyes and the heads of young Iranians. That's the first thing. The second thing is simply to support Iranians in their organic, internally led movement for democracy. So the previous administration had a policy which you likely have heard of, maximum pressure on the regime. What we think, what we hear often from Iranians, is of course you have to apply some pressure and some consequences to this regime. When you open fire and you slaughter 500 protesters since the beginning of this revolution, when you look back to November of 2019 and you slaughter 1,500 protesters in the span of 3 days, yeah, the people who did that deserve some pressure on them. And if people want to say that that means you're a warmonger or sanction hawk, libel away. But it's my personal opinion that if you open fire using military-grade weapons on children, yeah, maybe we should sanction you for human rights abuses. That's just my personal opinion. That's one step. The second step is maximum support of the Iranian people, providing them or helping facilitate the provision of internet access when a regime looks to completely shut them off from the outside world by blacking out the internet, as they did just before they massacred 1,500 people in November of 2019. By, to Susan's point, helping support Iranian strikers. Striking in Iran is not like striking anywhere else in the world. If you go on strike in Iran, you're going to lose your job, your family, your colleagues are going to be harassed, your business, the businesses of your loved ones are going to be, have Molotov cocktails thrown through their windows and rocks thrown through their windows. So you need a very minimal degree of financial support to be even able to go out and strike. And in a few weeks, our organization will be putting out what we view as a policy blueprint called Maximum Support that we think that the US government and other governments around the world can use as a blueprint for Iran policy, not to tell Iranians what to do, not to decide Iranians' fate for them, not to determine their destiny, but simply to support them and to ensure that just as the United States and just as other countries supported the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa, just as they helped and supported from behind the anti-communist movement in Eastern Europe, that the Iranian people are afforded that same dignity, that the Iranian people are afforded that same level of support, because we think that the life of an Iranian is not worth any less than the life of a South African, than any less of a person living behind the Iron Curtain, and it's finally time for the West to support the people of Iran. We've been doing a lot to support Ukraine, and it's costing a lot of money, and I think many would argue it's for a good cause. You can support the people of Iran for almost 0 cents, and that's what we're asking for. I think that's what the people of Iran are asking for.
So thank you, Cameron. That offers us some really nice specific policy prescriptions that we can act upon. And thank you, Suzanne, for your articulation of what is needed sort of culturally, but also this idea of thinking about national reconciliation and what happens after regime change. That hasn't always been considered in some major instances, right? So that thinking about that is really maybe I shouldn't use this term, but there could be some feminine wisdom in there, right?
Absolutely.
The balance of those wisdoms, I think, is really needed in instances like this. So I think that we put a lot out there, and we want to hear from you. So please, if you have questions, you can go to the mics on, I think there's one on either side. Asking your question at the mic is helpful because it'll get picked up by the video. So.
Oh, it's right there. Got it.
So yes, so we'll
So,
start with you on this.
Bonnie.
Is it on? Are they on? I don't know.
Can you hear me?
Oh, yes, we can. Hold on one second. I think we're good. Can you have your mic on? We'll start with you and then we'll come back to you in just one sec.
It's on now.
It's on now? Okay.
No.
No?
No.
Okay.
We can hear you. Can you?
We can hear you, yes.
Okay, great.
Okay.
It's on.
Okay, great.
Bonnie, thank you very much. Conrad and Suzanne, fantastic. Really appreciate it. So this is a conversation that it is on every Iranian's mind. I mean, Iranians talk about nothing else. But this is so important for us to engage with non-Iranians, with Americans, with Europeans. So this conversation must continue, and in fact, it's going to continue next week here, Thursday night, 7 p.m. We're going to have another forum, a policy panel focused on, and it's called Assessing the Future of U.S.-Iran Policy Amidst a Popular Uprising and Revolutionary Movement. And the panelists, kind of extending on the great panelists that have been here tonight, include Alex Vatankov, who is the Iran Program Director at the Middle East Institute, Dr. Ladan Burumand, who is a historian and human rights advocate and part of the Iranian delegation that went and saw Emmanuel Macron several months ago. Norm Rule, who's an expert in intelligence issues and U.S. foreign policy issues, and Jessica Imami, who is a fantastic sociologist. So really extending on this conversation, very happy that we're having it. And I know we have a number of other Iranian freedom activists here tonight, including Siamak Aram, who is here from NSG Iran. Thank you very much for all the great work you do in getting the voice, being the voice for Iranians and Iranian freedom. So the question I have for you is this. Talk to us, if you would, a little bit about the significance of women, young women, children, in the context of culture and honor and pride in Iran. And pride and honor are such big cultural themes. You get to sit with any Iranian, automatically they'll talk to you about 2,500 years of culture and how important is it culturally from an honor perspective, from a pride perspective, to have young women out on the streets, empty-handed, facing people with guns against them. And what does that mean? What does that translate into for the rest of the Iranian populace across age groups, across ethnicities? Thank you very much.
I was going to actually ask the men what they thought about it. So the Iranian men should speak about this. But I mean, what do you think, Kamran, as one of the Iranian men, Western educated, but still?
Well, Western educated. Pride.
Good question.
Yeah, thank you. Pride, honor. I mean, these are just a few of the words that come to mind when you see Iranian women, Iranian young women in particular, on the forefront of this movement. It's not just this most recent round of protests in the ongoing revolution. It's been happening for years that Iranian women have been leading, been at the forefront of the movement for democratic change in Iran. And it's just so unspeakably remarkable what's happening in Iran. To your point, Iranians, when it comes to pride and our history, we've had to often go back 2,500 years, and we can't go a single sentence without reminding somebody about Cyrus the Great, and did you know that 50 years ago our passport could do this, and all these fantastic things, and those are all true. But I'm really excited about the fact that now we have something new to be proud of. Now we can say it's not just 2,500 years ago that we had a king who exported human rights to the world, who introduced the world to equality and respect for people of different faiths and different backgrounds. Iranians today are again changing the world. And to answer the question of this panel, Iranian women are already changing the world. And it's just with immeasurable pride, as if Iranians needed more things to be proud about for themselves. But this is really, just taking things to a next level. It's going to go down in history, I think, what Iranian women are doing right now, what people like Mahsa, Nika, Hadis, before them, Neda Agha Sultan, what they've done for Iran will go down in Iran's history as one of the greatest epics that really deserves to be added to the pages of Shahnameh. But even outside of Iran's borders, it's going to go down in world history for having changed the world. And I mean, that I just can't say how proud that makes me. But more than that, more than pride, how appreciative I am, and really how just immeasurably humbled and thankful I am for the sacrifice that they're giving for a country of 85 million people and a world of 7+ billion, because they're changing it with their sacrifice.
If I just may add to what you said, it was such a great question because, of course, what I see happening in Iran is redefining pride in a way, because in that part of the world, we have honor killings, women and girls being killed because they are, not displaying themselves in certain ways, standing up for themselves, and shaming their menfolk and family, and then being killed for it. So there's even at this level of pride and honor, where there's a battle going on, what is actually honorable? And so, Iran is this is a process that Iran's going through, and redefining all these things again for itself, and redefining what honor and pride is. And women, young women, are going empty-handed, as you said, against forces, these men in their gear and all that stuff, and these women are standing up against it. The pride in that. And also that the men are standing up with them, that the men are coming out with them. And that's the honor. So it's so beautiful, because what I'm seeing is Iran evolving again, its notion, and reclaiming its notion of true pride and what it means to be masculine, what it means to be feminine. All those things are being redefined. So it's very it's exciting, and maybe we need a new book called Banuname.
Yes.
The Book of Queens. Maybe that's our next volume, and this part of our history is going to be put down in that.
Great. Well, we have a question over on the side as well.
So you can still hear me, right?
Yes.
Yes.
All right, so this is a bit of a longer one, but I'm gonna try and make this as short as I can. What I want to ask basically regards this sort of evolved or extreme position on moral and cultural relativism that you discussed earlier, that basically you can't actually criticize someone else's culture. This is a very slippery thing, and I've had multiple discussions of this sort where I'm like, people deserve human rights. Well, X group here, whether it be Islamic extremists or Nazis or whoever, wouldn't say that. And either you go into the weeds and you're like all subjective, and people are like even as basic of things as don't murder children in cold blood. Well, that's subjective. There are some number of people who believe that's not only morally acceptable, but morally righteous. And how are you to say that your subjective belief is any more valid than their subjective belief? Or you say, this is ridiculous, I'm not interested in giving this a fair hearing, in which case they'll say something like, you're being intolerant of X hypothetical person's beliefs, and you're proving yourself to be no better than them, who would also be equally intolerant of your beliefs. And so this gets me a lot, and I'm very frustrated about this. You can apply this to a lot of different places, including to this Iran debate that we've been having, and I think this speaks to the quote unquote slander you said against people who want regime change in Iran. So I wanted to know how you respond to that sort of thing.
Well, read the first part of my book because it takes it. I completely understand your frustration. First of all, it's, cultures are not homogeneous. So there are different parts of culture. There are different groups in factions in cultures. And oftentimes there are factions in the cultures that want to change, but they don't have the voice to change. So that's one thing. So when we say, well, it's their culture, culture is not one thing. There's pieces and, there are groups that are less powerful and more powerful, and the ones who are less powerful don't have a voice oftentimes. So that's one thing. But the other thing is that, what do we want for the future? I mean, the question is, yeah, you could be completely tolerant of everything, but what is that going to bring us as a world? Like, what are the things we want for our societies? And, in that case, that's a society-wide conversation. I mean, the idea of generative cultural renewal is about a conversation to be had in the society. What is generative? I mean, I have certain things that I've pointed out that are generative, but, and evidence-based that are generative, meaning productive, that bring us to a certain point in history. But, if you want a world that is repressive, where children don't flourish, where the environment is destroyed, yeah, keep oppressing women. I mean, it just depends on what you want to have happen down the line. It's all about, I also talk about cultural evolution and cultural devolution, devolving of cultures. And so, trauma tends to devolve cultures. And then cultures get stuck in certain patterns of trauma-based norms and values and practices. And they devolve. And, sometimes they need something to ignite them in a direction of evolution. And so that right now we're in a day and age where we can evolve through conversation. But we used to have religious leaders that would happen, or political leaders. So I don't know if I'm answering your question, but it's a good question and a complex one, and I appreciate your frustration. I'm glad you're frustrated, but,
yeah.
Because it is frustrating, isn't it?
If I can add two just very brief things. One, thank you for your question. It is tricky. I personally am intolerant of those whose intolerance impacts the physical safety of others, and whose intolerance impacts the livelihoods, the well-beings, the equality of others. So of course we can all have different views and different perspectives, but when those views and perspectives or values are forced on others or cause harm to others, that's where, at least personally, my line of tolerance is drawn. That's one. Two, it's very important, and I try to continue to draw this distinction, try to continue to draw it back to inside Iran. What's happening inside Iran is a movement that is led by the Iranian people. So when we talk about supporting Iran, when we talk about change in Iran, it's change demanded by and led by the people of Iran. So this is not somebody outside deciding for Iranians that things need to be different because we, the Americans, said so, because we, the British, said so, because we, the United Nations, said so. No, this is a matter of supporting and standing in solidarity with Iranians in them determining their own destiny. So it's really their values that they are determining, and we're not ascribing or saying what values are right. We're simply supporting them in their movement for their own values.
And I just want to underscore this because part of why I was bringing up in the beginning that what we're seeing in Iran are not a bunch of people or kids who've been affected just by social media and influenced by the Western world. Maybe the Western world reminded them of values that were ancient and indigenous to Iranians. I mean, there's a lot of evidence that Iranians, like the Greeks, like to think that everything came from them, but we did influence the Western world pretty significantly. And a lot of the values that come from, not necessarily democracy, but freedom of choice and other things are very old Persian values that got infiltrated into the Western world. And now the West is reminding Iran of its original values. So I see it that way, and I think that is really what's going on. So this is Iranian values. These are Iranian-led. Right. It's an Iranian-led movement.
Well, I'm sorry to have to bring this to a close, but I just look at my watch. My clock that I brought is not working.
That's why.
I have to stop working.
That's why I was looking at your.
Yeah, right.
It's an Iranian clock. It's late.
And my mic just fell off, so I guess it's time to stop. So.
We can continue the conversation if you
What
want.
I want,
I'm
yes,
sorry
I
to.
wanted to say, we'll be out in the lobby. We have refreshments. We hope you'll join us. We'll be there. You know how to find us now. So please, let's continue the conversation together out there. Thank you.
Thank you.